I want to start by saying how grateful I am to Maitree and to Civic Action for allowing us to do this, and of course to the Government of Ontario for its support. And I say this not because they're the sponsors, but because for well over 20 years I've been working on different aspects of diversity, and it's not very often that you see such well-designed, fact-based strategies as the DiverseCity project. It really is a model of taking research and translating it into effective action, and I'm very, very proud to be part of it. I want to thank the team at DiverseCity, including Sandra Lopes and her colleagues, for their help, and of course my team, Margaret Yap, our researchers, Lenny, Kristen, Shelley, and Cheryl, and of course the tiny but mighty Panubin Danny, who helped this all come together. Much of what I have said in previous years, I want to reiterate for the benefit of people who were not previously here. The DiverseCity Counts project really is a snapshot of diversity in leadership in the Greater Toronto Area. We focus on the 5 most diverse municipalities: Toronto, Brampton, Mississauga, Markham, and Richmond Hill, which represent almost 3/4 of the GTA population. And these particular municipalities have 50% visible minorities. And so, as Ratna said, they're hyper diverse. We have continued to track the same individuals in the same organizations over a 3-year period, looking at over 3,000 leaders, and this year, as you heard, we've also added a special look at the legal sector, and I think that both John and Ratna spoke to how important the legal sector is as a pipeline for leadership in other sectors of society. The fact that 3/4 of our prime ministers are lawyers gives us pause. We've also talked, and we've reiterated over and over, the business case for diversity. Of course there's a human rights case, of course there's employment equity and an ethics-based case, but we have very good evidence to support the notion that diverse leadership fuels organizational performance. It helps organizations serve increasingly diverse markets, it promotes innovation, and above all, it promotes images which then inspire others, and that's critically important. Ratna already mentioned that the glass is half full and half empty. There's no question over the course of the 3 years we have seen progress. When we started, 13.4% of the leaders we looked at were visible minorities. It's up to 14.5. That's actually a significant increase given the number of people that we looked at. Definitely good news, but as Ratna noted, at this rate, we will take a very long time before we get where we need to get. If we unpack where the leaders came from, a very interesting pattern emerges. The most progress we have seen, because we looked at 6 different sectors, the most progress that we have seen is in the domain of elected officials. We went from 16.1% to 19% visible minorities in elected roles. That is significant. We also saw a dramatic increase in agencies, boards, and commissions from 18.6% to 22%, fueled in large part by progress in the province of Ontario's appointments. So again, Dr. Hoskins and his government deserve credit for really making this a priority, and Ontario's diversity strategy has paid off in a number of ways. But the other news is that we have not seen progress in the corporate sector. We have not seen progress, this may surprise you, in the voluntary sector, and the progress in the public sector has still proceeded at a snail's pace, although there has been some advance. If we look at what happened in elected office, the last election, the federal election, frankly changed nothing. People were defeated, people were elected, and the composition of Parliament, at least in terms of GTA representation, did not change. Where we saw progress in elected officials is at the school board level and the municipal level. So we saw that school boards went from 20.9% to 26.9%, very significant increase, and municipal councillors went from 10.3% to 13.5%, again very significant. We can't prove a causal connection, but it is worth noting that these are areas that Maitrey and Civic Action in the diversity project have put a lot of their energy. And so it may be an early indication of the impact of their work in building the pipeline there. If we look in the public sector, the story in our municipalities is not a good one. Still very, very low level of visible minority representation in the municipal civil service. Police executives doing not badly, but you have to remember that a difference of one has a profound impact. So what you're seeing, those of you who can see the graph in police executives, is basically the retirement of Deputy Chief Ford accounts for that change. Assistant and deputy ministers in the provincial government from 9.6% to 11%. Again, a success story, perhaps a reflection of the mindful attention diversity has received in the Ontario Public Service. And so overall, some progress in the public sector, primarily at the provincial level. In the corporate sector, sadly, not much progress at all in either senior management or boards of directors. The private sector is pretty much where it was when we started. And the same is true in the voluntary sector, which may surprise you. We know that smaller charities and nonprofits do have reasonable representation of visible minorities, but the largest charities, both at the board level and the executive level, are very unrepresentative. Only about 12.5% are visible minorities. Education may not surprise you. Education is doing quite well. We've seen a little bit of progress, but both at the level of principals, at the levels of leadership in colleges and universities, we have a reasonably high level of diversity. Certainly, we can do better, but the education sector is one of our success stories. And as I mentioned at the outset, agencies, boards, and commissions, another success story. City of Toronto made diversity a priority in its agencies, boards, and commissions a number of years ago, and that paid off huge dividends. We're now starting to see similar progress at the provincial level. So what else can we tell you, apart from these big differences from sector to sector, which I think suggest ways of moving forward? I've mentioned before that it's very hard for me to understand how people trying to find candidates for corporate boards of directors can argue that there are not candidates available when it would seem reasonable to think that experience on, for example, the board of a billion-dollar educational institution would give you skills that might be transferable. So we have to continue to look at where the opportunities are to pull people from one sector into another. And there are some examples of people who have made that movement, but probably not enough. The other thing, though, that we have to really draw attention to is that the averages in every sector mask huge variations. So within the corporate sector, 6.4% of boards and 12.1% of executive groups are more than 20% visible minority, okay? So we know for sure that among the largest corporations in the GTA, there are some where 1 in 5 executives, 1 in 5 board members are visible minorities. We also know that 70% have zero. Okay, 70% have 0. That suggests that there's lots of room for improvement. One of the things that we focused on, as you heard this year, was the legal sector, and I'm really delighted with the support that we received from the University of Toronto, from Osgoode, from the Law Society, the Bar Association, many of the large law firms in doing the analysis. It really signaled that there is a strong commitment to moving forward. And it was mentioned, the legal sector is important because it's a pipeline for leadership in so many other areas. And of course, the handsome John Tory is a case in point. We're not going to get into trouble over that, are we? It's already been mentioned that, as in other sectors, there is a business case for diversity in the legal sector. Changing client needs. Julia Hennigsberg, who you met, our Vice President of Administration at Ryerson, is one of the founding members of a new group called Legal Leaders for Diversity, who are in-house counsels at large organizations who are now saying clearly and publicly, we are going to consider diversity when we make decisions about who we buy legal services from. That's a huge move, and that's probably going to generate action on Bay Street much more quickly than almost anything else anybody could do. But it signals that clients are changing, and as clients changing, law practices have to change as well. Expanding market opportunities globally, the importance, of course, of lawyers in shaping policy and the administration of justice in building our democracy. All of these are very, very important reasons for taking diversity in leadership in the legal sector seriously. We know from the long-form census that 14.4% of practicing lawyers in Toronto are visible minorities as of 2006. We also heard this morning from Sujit Chandri, the Associate Dean of the University of Toronto Law School, that law students now about 30%, right? So the pipeline is definitely building, but we also know that there are huge gaps among lawyers in terms of earning potential and in terms of representation in the senior-most roles in the legal community. Part of this is the lack of networks. I was speaking this morning about the intersection between class and socioeconomic status and visible minority status. Access to people with money often has a real impact on access to opportunities, for example, on Bay Street. And so if you happen to be from a priority neighborhood, you may get to be a lawyer, but your chances of ending up on Bay Street are far reduced compared to someone who grew up in Forest Hill, for example. And so we really have to grapple with that. We also know that within law firms, there are barriers. Developing your career and aspiring to a partnership in a big Bay Street firm means that you have to be able to develop business. You have to manage clients. All skills that they don't necessarily teach in law school, and there has to be deliberate mentoring to help people build the business. We also know, and John mentioned this in passing, that many young people aspire to be lawyers because they want to change the world. They want to change the world. They may be self-selecting out some of the specializations which lead to wealth and power. Not that wealth and power are the only thing we should aspire to. I'd vote for changing the world too. But it's important that young people understand the choices that they're making, even at law school, that may preclude them from getting access to those Bay Street jobs. And the issues of the lack of diversity in judicial appointments and among Crown attorneys and deputy crowns is something that really requires attention, because the face of the legal system has a huge impact on perceptions of fairness and access to justice. So, what did we do? We looked specifically at judges in the GTA. We looked at governing bodies such as the Law Society of Upper Canada. We looked at law school leadership. We looked at the at the partners in the top 20 law firms. And the top 20 law firms in the GTA are all corporate law firms. We looked at Crown and Deputy Crown attorneys, and we also looked at JPs. JPs are not lawyers, but they play an important role. We relied on publicly available information and used the same method that we used for the other DiverseCity Counts sectors. And the findings, a little bit disappointing. So when you look at judges, 8.3% are visible minorities. When you look at benchers in the Law Society and leaders in the Canadian Bar Association and leaders in law schools, 10.5% are visible minorities. When you look at partners in law firms, the big 20 law firms, 6.6% are visible minorities. And again, this average masks a huge variation. Some Bay Street law firms, 12%, 13% visible minorities. Some, under 1%. And I'm sure Julia and her crew are going to be looking at that very seriously. Currently, crowns, deputy crowns, no visible minorities that we could find. And as I said, justices of the peace are not lawyers, they're appointments, but 44.4%, almost representative of the population. So what are the recommendations for the law sector? We really have to work together with the key stakeholders in this area, with the law schools. Julia's already mentioned our law center at Ryerson is very committed to moving this forward, with the Law Society, the Bar Association, with the big firms, and certainly with the many of the specialist legal associations, because there are many ethnic law organizations that are really committed to this work as well. We have to look very seriously at the process for judicial appointments, how that happens, how to expand the pool. We have to focus on advancing and continuing to advance and continuing to evaluate the initiatives by the governing organizations, and certainly they're doing great work. They have to keep doing it. We have to continue to communicate the importance of this. And as I've said very often before, money talks, and I think that some of the initiatives around looking at diversity in procurement will have a big impact very, very quickly. But we have to help those law firms move forward. And sometimes it's not a lack of will, it's a lack of strategy, and so there's lots to do there. There are ways to partner large firms with smaller minority-led firms, which have to be exploited. We have to develop the pipeline. Work that's going on at the University of Toronto and elsewhere to integrate internationally educated professional lawyers, huge, very important, and needs to continue. And of course, above all, it's not just my bias. I think there's good fact to support it. We have to continue to track and to measure, because as Ratna so eloquently said, what gets measured gets done. And if you hold people's feet to the fire, simply by shining the light on the numbers and ensuring transparency, we will move this forward much more quickly. Our recommendations for all sectors haven't changed. They've just been reinforced the more we look at this issue. Focus on the business case. There is no doubt that diversity in leadership is good for organizations, makes them more successful. Make diversity a priority. I think leadership by people like John Tory and Ratna are huge in terms of keeping this on the public agenda. We have to, and certainly Minister Hoskins and his government and other elected officials need to continue to make this a priority. We have to mainstream diversity. It isn't just a function for human resources departments. It has to be a strategic priority in organizations and tied to their competitive strategies. We have to continue to develop the pipeline and to think further ahead. Where are the next generation of leaders going to come from? That's why the DiverseCity project is so very, very important. And again, we have to keep counting. So thank you very much for taking time to come today. We really appreciate your interest and, of course, the support of our patrons. Thank you so much.